What if the question was never, when were you born, but who are you protecting? What if narcissism has nothing to do with months, stars, or personality labels, and everything to do with a single illusion you've been carrying your whole life? What if the most narcissistic behavior you've ever witnessed was not written in fate, but practiced, reinforced, and defended every single day? Stay with me, because Buddhism has been warning us about narcissism for over 2,000 years, just not with that word. Before we go any further, this must be said clearly. From a Buddhist perspective, birth month has no role in narcissism. Not January, not August, not any month at all. There is no concept in Buddhism that links ego, suffering, or self-centeredness to the time you were born. If you are looking for answers in astrology, Buddhism gently but firmly turns your head in another direction. Not upward, but inward. Because Buddhism does not ask when you were born. It asks something far more uncomfortable. Who do you think you are? And this is where many people become uneasy. Because if narcissism were about birth month, it would mean some people are simply unlucky. But Buddhism does not offer that comfort. It says something far more confronting. It says, narcissism is not fate. It is attachment. Attachment to an idea. Attachment to an identity. Attachment to a self that must be defended at all costs. And the moment you hear that, something shifts. In Buddhism, suffering begins with ignorance, not lack of intelligence, not lack of information. Ignorance of one thing only, the belief that there is a solid, permanent, separate self. This belief has a name in Buddhism, anatta, non-self, or, more accurately, the absence of a fixed self. From this perspective, narcissism is not a disorder. It is not a personality trait. It is a misunderstanding of reality. And once you see it that way, the entire conversation changes. Think about it. If there is no permanent self, what exactly is being admired? If there is no solid identity, what is being protected? If everything is changing, fluid, impermanent, why does someone need constant validation? Why does criticism feel like annihilation? Why does disagreement feel like attack? Buddhism has a very quiet answer. In Buddhist teaching, the ego is not evil. It is not demonized. It is understood. The ego is a protective structure. It exists to guard an imagined self from an imagined threat. That threat is not real danger. It is ego death, the fear of not being special, not being superior, not being right, not being seen. From this view, narcissism is simply ego, under constant threat. Here is where Buddhism differs radically from modern personality labels. Buddhism does not say, this person is a narcissist. It says, this person is deeply attached to a self-image, and attachment always creates suffering for them and for those around them. Now let's talk about why people want birth months to explain narcissism. Because birth months offer distance. If narcissism comes from astrology, then it is not relational. It is not shaped by trauma. It is not reinforced by power. It is not rewarded by attention. It is simply how they are. Buddhism refuses this shortcut. It says, look at craving, look at aversion, look at ignorance. That is where narcissism lives. In Buddhism, There are three roots of suffering: craving, aversion, ignorance. Narcissism feeds on all three: craving admiration, aversion to criticism, ignorance of impermanence. And none of these have anything to do with the month you were born. Here is a quiet but powerful question. When someone reacts defensively, when they cannot apologize, when they must always be right, what are they protecting? Their birth month? Or an identity that feels fragile? If you have ever been close to someone narcissistic, you already know this truth intuitively. Their reactions were not mystical. They were not cosmic. They were predictable, triggered when their image was threatened, triggered when control was lost, triggered when admiration stopped. Buddhism would say, you were not witnessing fate, you were witnessing attachment. So if Buddhism does not believe in narcissistic birth months, if it does not believe in fixed selves, then the real question becomes unavoidable. If narcissism is not written in the stars, where does it come from? And more importantly, how does it trap both the person who embodies it and the people who orbit around them? That's where we're going next. In part 2, we will explore how ego forms, why identity becomes addictive, and how narcissism is rewarded by the modern world, even though Buddhism warned against it centuries ago. And this is where things get uncomfortable. If narcissism is not written in the stars, if it is not assigned at birth, then the question becomes unavoidable. How does it form? And an even harder question follows. Why does it feel so powerful, so convincing, and so difficult to let go of? Buddhism has an answer, and it is not comforting. In Buddhism, the ego is not something you are born with. It is something that forms, slowly, quietly, through repetition. A child is not born narcissistic. A child is born sensitive. Sensitive to approval, sensitive to rejection, sensitive to attention. And every time attention feels like safety, the mind learns something dangerous. The mind learns, this version of me is acceptable. This version of me is safe. This version of me must be protected. And just like that, identity begins to harden. Not because it is true, but because it works. Buddhism teaches that identity is not who you are. It is what you cling to. The ego is built from fragments. Praise you received, shame you avoided, power that protected you, validation that calmed you. Over time, these fragments form a shell. And once the shell exists, everything becomes about maintaining it. Here is something Buddhism understood long before modern psychology. The ego is addictive, not because it feels good all the time, but because it feels necessary. Admiration becomes oxygen, control becomes stability, being right becomes survival. When these are threatened, the nervous system reacts as if death is near. This is why narcissistic reactions feel so extreme. From the inside, they are not exaggerations. They are panic responses. Think about it. If someone's sense of self depends on being admired, then criticism feels like annihilation. If someone's identity depends on control, then boundaries feel like betrayal. If someone's worth depends on superiority, then equality feels like humiliation. This is not personality. This is attachment. Buddhism describes a chain: ignorance, craving, attachment, suffering. Narcissism lives inside this chain: ignorance of impermanence, craving validation, attachment to identity, suffering when reality refuses to cooperate, and reality always refuses. Here is where Buddhism becomes uncomfortable for our time. Modern society rewards ego. Visibility is currency. Attention is power. Being admired is survival. The more rigid the identity, the more predictable the persona, the easier it is to market. From a Buddhist lens, this is a perfect storm, an ego-based world feeding ego-based suffering. If you've ever felt drained after interacting with someone narcissistic, it wasn't because they were born under a certain month. It was because their identity needed constant reinforcement. Your presence became a resource, and the moment you stopped supplying it, tension began. Buddhism would say, you were standing too close to someone's attachment. This is critical. Buddhism does not reject confidence. It rejects clinging. Confidence flows. Ego defends. Confidence listens. Ego reacts. Confidence allows correction. Ego experiences correction as threat. This is why narcissism cannot rest. Here is the hardest truth. To let go of narcissism, one must let go of identity, not improve it, not refine it, not justify it. Let go. And from the ego's perspective, that feels like death. This is why insight alone is not enough. Ask yourself, if someone cannot apologize, cannot sit with discomfort, cannot admit uncertainty, what would collapse if they did? Their birth month or their self-image? If you were close to someone narcissistic, you were not dealing with mystery. You were dealing with fear disguised as confidence, insecurity disguised as dominance, attachment disguised as strength. Buddhism sees this clearly, and it does not shame it. It simply says, this is suffering in motion. So now we know this. Narcissism is not fate, not astrology, not destiny. It is attachment to self, which leads to the final question. If ego is the source, if attachment is the fuel, what is the way out? And more importantly, how do you protect yourself without becoming hardened, bitter, or lost? That is where part 3 begins. In the final part, we will explore how Buddhism dissolves narcissism without attacking it, how detachment is not indifference, and how awareness protects you better than confrontation ever could. This is where clarity replaces confusion. If narcissism is attachment to self, and ego is the illusion that must be defended, then here is the most dangerous question of all. What happens when you stop fighting it? What happens when you don't argue, don't explain, don't expose, don't diagnose, and don't try to win? Buddhism offers an answer that feels counterintuitive, almost offensive to the modern mind. It says, you don't defeat the ego, you outgrow it. Buddhism does not treat narcissism as an enemy, because fighting the ego only strengthens another ego. Instead, Buddhism introduces something far more radical: awareness without attachment. Not cold detachment, not indifference, but clarity without entanglement. This is the difference that saves people. Many people believe that exposing a narcissist will free them. Buddhism quietly disagrees. Why? Because exposure attacks identity, and identity under attack does not soften. It hardens. The ego does not dissolve when challenged, it fortifies. This is why confrontation often escalates narcissistic behavior instead of resolving it. Think about it. If someone's sense of self depends on being superior, what happens when you prove them wrong? If someone survives through control, what happens when you try to take it away? From a Buddhist lens, you are not correcting behavior, you are threatening existence. Buddhism teaches that freedom does not come from changing others. It comes from seeing clearly, seeing craving arise, seeing attachment tighten, seeing ego react, and then not stepping into the reaction. This is where protection begins, not with walls, not with explanations, but with non-participation. When you stop feeding the ego dynamic, something subtle happens. Drama has no fuel. Validation loses leverage. Control finds no grip. This does not mean becoming silent or submissive. It means responding without self-betrayal. From a Buddhist view, this is the highest form of strength. Instead of asking, "How do I make them see?" you begin asking, "Why am I stepping into this cycle?" Instead of, "How do I expose their narcissism?" you ask, "What attachment is being triggered in me?" This shift changes everything. This must be said clearly. Detachment in Buddhism is not emotional numbness. It is freedom from compulsion. You still care. You still feel. You still choose compassion. But you no longer sacrifice your clarity to maintain someone else's identity. If you were harmed by narcissistic behavior, Buddhism does not ask you to forgive prematurely. It asks you to understand deeply. Understanding does not excuse harm. It releases confusion, and confusion is what kept you trapped. Here is the truth few want to hear. You cannot awaken someone who is deeply attached to their ego. Awakening is voluntary, and suffering is often the only teacher ego listens to. This is not cruelty, it is reality. Buddhism offers something more valuable than answers about birth months. It offers freedom from personalization. You stop asking, "Why are they like this?" and begin understanding, this is attachment expressing itself. And suddenly, it's no longer about you. Ask yourself gently, where do I still seek validation? Where do I still fear being unseen? Where does my identity feel threatened? This is not accusation. This is awakening. Because narcissism is not them. It is a potential in every ego that has not been seen clearly yet. Buddhism never asked what month you were born in. It asked, what are you clinging to? What are you defending? And what would remain if you let go? That is where freedom lives. If this episode shifted something inside you, if it replaced confusion with quiet clarity, stay with this path, not because you need to fix anyone, but because awareness changes how deeply things can hurt you. And if you know someone still trapped in identity, confusion, or self-blame, share this gently. Sometimes awakening doesn't come from answers. It comes from finally asking the right questions. No birth month, no destiny, only ego, and beyond it, peace.